Greetings all, and welcome to Luca Sprues. In this build video, I'll be covering my first test build of 4 1/72nd scale Clarktor-6 aircraft tugs, which I designed for 3D printing and have currently available on my Cults page. So without further ado, let's get into it. Off camera, I 3D printed all of the parts for the tugs, washed them in my wash and cure machine using some methylated spirits, removed the parts from their supports, and then cured them in UV light using my curing machine. After that, I gave all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to clean off any remaining loose supports or any dust. A few of the smaller supports I'd missed cleaning up previously were then removed from the rear bumper and driver's area, before all parts were placed on some balsa wood with blue tack and then primed with some Vallejo gloss black primer. You could probably remove some of the print lines with some wet sanding or use Mr. Surfacer primer, which I need to try out on resin, but generally I found all of the parts were pretty clean and only had minimal print lines. Once all the parts were a solid glossy black colour, I left everything aside overnight to allow the primer to cure. For the Mil 44, which has the double back tyres, I decided to paint it yellow, a colour often seen on post-World War II vehicles. Whenever I want to paint something yellow, I always do a pink base coat. In this case, I airbrushed a mixture of 4 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 1 drop of model colour 70958 pink and 2 drops of Vallejo Model Air Insignia white. I built up the pink until it was a reasonably solid colour, but kept it thin in some spots to allow some black to show through, creating shadows. While the pink cured, I painted the other 3 Clarktors in other colours. For one of them, I decided to do a early World War II US Navy blue, which was often used on Navy vehicles. I airbrushed a mixture of 2 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver with 2 drops of Vallejo Model Air Faded PRU Blue, which is the colour Vallejo recommends for the early US Navy two-tone schemes, like those seen on Dauntlesses, Devastators and Wildcats during the Battle of Midway. The last 2 Clarktors were painted using the same ratio of paint to thinners, but with a base coat of Model Air No. 41 Olive Drab to make them US Army Air Force tugs from World War II. By the time the other 3 tugs had been painted in their base colours, the pink was well and truly dry on the 4th one, so I went ahead and applied a few thin coats of Vallejo Model Air RLM04 yellow, thinned down again with an even mixture of 1 part flow improver to 1 part paint. As you can see, the pink base coat really helps with applying yellow paint, making it solid in less layers. With that, all of the tugs were done in their base coats, so I then moved on to doing some highlights. For the US Navy Blue tug, I mixed a few drops of Insignia White with a drop of PRU Blue from earlier, and sprayed this mostly from above the model and focused on the middle of larger surfaces. These subtle highlights would also help to make the paint look a little bit weathered. The highlights on the Olive Drab tugs were created by using Vallejo Model Air 71016 Olive Drab, which is a lighter shade than the No. 41 Olive Drab. For the yellow tugs highlights, I added a drop of Insignia White to a drop of the same RLM04 yellow. Next came painting the details, which were all very similar across the 4 tugs. Model Air aluminium was applied onto the engine blocks of all vehicles, followed by model colour flat black for their tyres. I designed the rims to be slightly raised above the tyre, so if you thin down the black heavily and apply it very carefully, the capillary motion will help guide the paint around the edge of the rim, making it a lot easier to paint the tyres without any issues. Flat black was also used to paint the knobs on various levers, as well as the steering wheels and some engine details. Model colour vermilion red was used for part of the engine details as well, and once again flat black would be used, this time to paint the seats of the olive drab and yellow vehicles. You may notice that on one of my olive drab tugs, the rear backrest is missing, which was a result of this being an earlier prototype having thinner seat frames, and a more delicate steering wheel and engine wiring, which I would slightly beef up before printing the other prototypes. For a bit of difference, I painted the blue navy tug seat with model colour English uniform for a more dull brown. The exhaust system was then painted a base coat of model colour Old Rust to give them a burnt oxide effect, and then I sealed all of the paint in and prepped the tugs for decals with a solid coat of gloss varnish on all of the parts. I allowed the Vallejo gloss varnish to cure for 24 hours, before then applying some decals by sticking the transfers I had in warm water, applying some Tamiya decal adhesive onto where the decals would go, sliding the loose decals into position, and then giving them a coat of Vallejo decal softener using a brush. I had some spare decals from several Academy Willys Jeeps which I'd all built as Soviet ones, but in the future I might design my own proper set with serials, which were usually applied onto the bonnet and front grille. Once applied, the decals were given 12 hours to set, and then for one of the olive drab tugs, I used a needle to poke the grille holes into the larger star decal, and the result looked pretty good in my opinion. The decals would then all be sealed in and the paint job given a duller matte finish by spraying the models in several passes of Vallejo matte varnish. The varnish would then be allowed to cure for 24 hours, and then the tugs were assembled, which is pretty simple to do. I would recommend adding the engine covers and bonnet first, but the order doesn't particularly matter. The rear wheels have square keys to fit them to the rear axles, while the front wheels have two knobs that can be slotted onto the steering rack and lined up with the axles. You could possibly have the front wheels turned at an angle, but I believe the entire steering rack would have also moved when the vehicle turned in real life, so this wouldn't be entirely accurate. The grille piece has some subtle keys that help line it up with the lower chassis, and the engine covers and bonnets are pretty easy to slide into place. I found that the engine bonnet is a little bit of a tight fit, but the engine covers fit very nicely. My glue of choice for resin is usually Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, which dries clear and is pretty strong like super glue, but slightly less brittle, and it also dries a little bit slower, so you have slightly more working time. For the navy and one of the olive drab tugs, I decided to leave the engine covers off, which you often see in photos, especially of wartime Clarktors. Since these engines would be much more visible, I gave them a panel wash using Tamiya black panel accent, and once the excess had been removed with some X20 enamel thinners, I then assembled them much like the others, but without the covers. I decided to make all my tugs look well used by then applying some weathering, the first of which would be some paint damage and chipping from the vehicles being scratched or bumping things, which you often see in photos, especially of heavily used ones. All of the tugs were given an initial layer of chipping by mixing Insignia White with their original base colours to produce a slightly lighter and saturated version of each colour. This would then be dry brushed onto the edges and corners, and heavily around the footwells and places that objects might scrape against the vehicle if the driver was not careful, or where people would put their feet while getting into and operating the tug. This layer of chipping is pretty subtle and helps replicate lighter scratches and scuffs where the paint has been damaged but not fully shown through. For the deeper scratches, I would use Vallejo Model Color Old Rust by carefully dabbing small amounts into the middle of the lighter chips. I've often seen Plasmo use this technique for chipping armoured vehicles, and it gives a very nice depth effect, but also looks nice when done subtly. I really loved how this effect turned out on the yellow tug in particular, as it looked a lot like a piece of very well used construction equipment. Once I was happy with the old rust chipping, I then painted each tug's headlight and taillight with a coat of Model Air RLM01 Silver to give them a shiny base colour. The last colour used for chipping was a bit of Model Air Aluminium. This was mainly used on the engine cover handles and for some fresher scratches that had not yet rusted out on the edges of the mudguards and around the footwells, although I kept this effect very restrained. To then finish up the weathering, I used a mixture of Uptilong 502 oil paints to add various shades of brown, thinned down with AK Interactive odorless thinners to create light dust on the wheels and seat, as well as some darker dirt and mud on the mudguards and in spots where people would step. I did this mostly on the yellow and olive drab tugs, but still did some very light buff weathering on the navy one for some subtle staining on just the tyres. The final touch was to paint the tail lights on each tug with Tamiya Clear Red, and with that, my prototype Clarktor-6 tugs were finally completed. And here you can see the finished tugs. Not to sound too full of myself, but I'm really happy with how the design turned out. The front wheels are a bit of a tight fit, but as you can see they can be slapped together and painted up pretty quickly without requiring any major cleanup or sanding and still look pretty decent. The Clarktor-6 is a pretty amazing little machine that was capable of towing any aircraft the US Army Air Force fielded during World War II, even apparently a fully loaded B-29. The RAF also made good use of towing their heavy bombers with them, and you can find this rugged little machine in the background of many World War II photos and even well into the Cold War. The STLs for both the normal and heavy-duty double rear wheel version are available as one download for $4 AUD on my Colts page, so if you want to 3D print some for yourself, you can. The files are available in both 1/72nd scale and also 1/32nd scale, although they're pretty similar, with the only major difference being that the 32nd scale one has some slightly thinner parts, while the 72nd scale one is beefed up a little bit. I will definitely be building more of my little Tugs in the future, as I'm sure they'll be very handy in dioramas or future animations, and I'll very likely also be designing some other variations of seats, a few different drivers from different air forces that use the Clarktors, and also possibly some tow bars to go with them, although I've found that tow bars are pretty difficult to 3D print without them warping because they're so small and thin, so I reckon you would be ultimately better off to scratch build them using styrene in most cases. Thank you very much for watching this build video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you would like to help fund my future videos, 3D designs and other projects, please consider joining my Patreon page or downloading the STLs for this design. Of course, you can also support the channel for free by subscribing, making sure you like this video and leaving a comment. A massive thank you to everyone for helping to support the channel, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons who helped me to fund not only buying and designing these kits, but also the products I use to make them and the time I spent working on these videos. As of late, I've been working on more 3D designs and doing a fair bit of prototyping, so in the coming months you'll see a fair few new ones getting added to my cults page, and I'll also be later doing videos like what I did with these Clarktor-6s. In terms of plastic kits for build videos, I have several Corsairs and also a Tamiya N1K1 getting very close to completion, so I should have videos coming out for them in the next couple weeks. Some of you may have noticed I missed Forgotten Friday in July, and it's not because I forgot. Unfortunately, I was a bit sick, so I wasn't able to finish the video which I had planned, which is going to be a build of the Tamiya F51D Mustang, which I think you can sort of see in the background there. So that one's going to be coming out in August instead. So that's everything for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.